so Zoditu, thanks so much for agreeing to talk about the Odyssey. I wanted to chat with you because I know you're a freshman in the honors program, you're taking Honors 150, and for so many students, the Odyssey is a key text, just a moment where
Mhm.
the program comes alive and there's so many themes that students resonate with. So yeah, one of the questions that I wanted to ask you was the following. I mean, what does home mean to you?
I would say, whew, that is a difficult question to answer because I am Ethiopian by birth, but I've grown up in the States for part of my life, so I'm an American citizen. But from the age of 9 to 17, I lived in 5 different African nations because
Wow.
my family worked with a humanitarian organization. So home is not it's not an address. Like I can't just say,
Mm,
"Oh, that's my home." It's it's a feeling of belonging,
mm,
knowing that I'm surrounded by people who understand kind of the anomaly of this weird cultural identity,
mm,
and I would say my family really understands that, so they constitute my home.
mm. Yeah, I can totally understand that. Part of the reason why I wanted to have this conversation with you in particular is because I have a similar background, just having grown up abroad. I'm Venezuelan by heritage, but I grew up in Southeast Asia and did my studies in Europe and then came back to the US. So, born in the United States, but only really started living here when I was 15. And so the concept of home has always been just very complicated for me. When somebody asks, "Where are you from?"
Mm-hmm.
I always say my parents are from Venezuela, and then move on, right? And it's just I need to know somebody well in order to get into that question. But the Odyssey was just such an important text for me to come to a new understanding of what the complexity of what home entails, right? And so, as you said, family, but there's also nation, there's also um, people, or even food and culture that you associate with your identity. Um, so yeah, thanks for that. So let's move on to the second question. This is where let's get into the text, right? To give some context, the Odyssey is about Odysseus, who, after the Trojan War, he's a veteran. He is on his own journey back to Ithaca, his home. And so a lot of this Homeric epic is about what home means,
Mm-hmm.
right? And Homer speaks about Odysseus's overcoming many different obstacles, whether that's Charybdis and Scylla, or the Sirens, or his time with Calypso and Circe. There are so many episodes that punctuate the text and show just the difficulty of reaching home, as it were. So I wanted to focus on one part of this text, which is when Odysseus actually returns to Ithaca.
Mm-hmm.
For 12 books, we've been anticipating this return, and then we have this scene where Athena, the goddess, who is closely associated with Odysseus, comes to him and puts him in this mist, right, to kind of hide his identity when he comes on the shores of Ithaca. So, what are some of the things that stuck out to you? Like, what do you think Homer is emphasizing about this return to Ithaca after so long?
I would say the part where it says the heart racing was significant considering, as we have read previously, that there's this mist. So even though there's this mist, he's clouded his sight. Like in his heart, there is something greater,
Mm.
and that I found pretty significant. Um,
Yeah, there's also the goddess. Athena is known as cunning
mhm.
and deceptive. And Odysseus also is cunning and deceptive. So part of this coming home is this mutual recognition where Odysseus sees in Athena many of his own qualities. So this is in the same book when he returns to Ithaca. Actually, Athena says this to Odysseus. Any man, any god who met you would have to be some champion, lying cheat to get past you. For all round craft and guile, you terrible man, foxy, ingenious, never tired of twists and tricks. So not even here on native soil would you give up those wily tales that warm the cockles of your heart. Come, enough of this now. We're both old hands at the art of intrigue. Right? So I think there's a sense in which Odysseus and Athena have a moment of recognition when he's at home, right? So I think part of what Homer is saying is that um, Odysseus comes to recognize who he is, who he truly is, in this place.
So he's finding his own nature at
Yeah.
home?
Yeah, or he's coming into his own after all this time. One other thing that we can look at is page 290. This is when the Phaeacian crew, Odysseus has been traveling with these Phaeacian sailors, and they bring him to Ithaca. But what's interesting here is that he is asleep, and I believe that he's naked when he shows up in Ithaca. So maybe we can read this passage and just talk about what that means for his arrival. All right, so on page 290, Odysseus arrives, and he arrives asleep. So I'll just read a portion of this. Here at this bay, the Phaeacian crew put in. They'd known it long before, driving the ship so hard, she ran up onto the beach for a good half her length. Such way the oarsmen's brawny arms had made. Up from the benches, swinging down to land, first they lifted Odysseus off the decks, linen and lustrous carpet too, and laid him down on the sand asleep, still dead to the world. Then hoisted out the treasures, proud Phaeacians, urged by open-hearted Pallas, had lavished on him, setting out for home. So I think here there's a sense in which Odysseus is asleep when he arrives, right? And he's also in this mist, as you mentioned before. What do you think that says about his arrival? I mean, you would think that, one, when he gets to Ithaca, he's just like overwhelmed by the sense of home. Mm-hmm. But instead, he's brought there in a very passive way. And he doesn't seem so elated. He seems actually more guarded when he arrives. So what are some of your thoughts on that?
It's interesting that you're right, he's not awake for that. The moment that we've been waiting for in this book, like, finally he's home, wake up. And even with the treasures, like, he's given all this beautiful stuff from Athena, and he still is not awake to it. Mm-hmm. So I'm almost waiting for, is there something that's going to come that will awaken him finally to the fact that he's home? Yeah,
and you can say that when he gets to Ithaca and he realizes that it is Ithaca, it is a type of awakening, right? It's a realization, a moment of truth for himself, where, as we were saying before, he kind of grows into his identity, as it were. I did want to touch on Penelope, though, before we end this section. So if we go to the later book, I believe this is book 23. So just for some context, spoiler alert to all who are watching, Odysseus makes it back home, and he is given this mission by Athena, and he has to purge his house of the suitors. Penelope, his wife, has been waiting for him, and she's heard rumors. Is he dead? Is he alive? She doesn't know what to believe. So even when he has killed all his enemies, Penelope will test him to see if it is truly Odysseus who has returned. And so the focus of this test is the great rooted bed, their bed together. So what were some parts in this section that you think are important for understanding this homecoming concept? Like, if Penelope represents home for Odysseus, how does this bring that kind of to a head?
Well, she tested him because she wanted to make sure he was the Odysseus she knew. And considering he had been gone for like 20-some years, he had been with all sorts of women, we know. So in a way, she's like, do you remember me? Do you remember the promise that we have together? And I think that was why she asked about the marriage bed, like, can our marriage bed be moved? And the answer is no, it cannot be, and only the husband would know. So I think that was significant. Because she wanted to make sure that the relationship was still deeply intact.
Yeah, so that's that loyalty. I think that's really, really interesting. So some of the language here talks about like secret signs between Penelope and Odysseus. And, she teases him in a way. She says to her handmaid, "Come, Eurycleia, move the sturdy bedstead out of our bridal chamber, that room the master built with his own hands." So they're kind of referencing Odysseus to taunt him. "Take it out now, sturdy bed that it is, and spread it deep with fleece. blankets and lustrous throws to keep him warm. And then, it moves to Odysseus. Putting her husband to the proof, but Odysseus blazed up in fury, lashing out at his loyal wife. Woman, your words, they cut me to the core. Who could move my bed? Impossible task. And he goes on to talk about how the bed was a great sign, a hallmark. I know I built it myself, no one else. Mm-hmm. So part of this homecoming is their relationship being solidified in this final proof, right? There's also this language of at last, finally, I'm with you. We are reunited. So those are some elements I think in the text that really bring home that concept that we've been discussing.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I felt the part on page 463, finally, he embraces her. He wept as he held the wife he loved, the soul of loyalty in his arms at last. It's like, yes, that's home. He's come back.
Right. Yeah, no, totally. I love that part. And I'm in love with Penelope. So, when I read this, I'm like, oh, diehard romantic. I love it. So why don't we move on to a third question? And so we've talked a little bit about your concept of home. We've talked about how that plays out in the Odyssey. And I was just curious, Zodi, too, about your experience in your freshman year here at Fox and in the honors program. How has your reading of the Odyssey shaped your experience coming home or coming to college from home, and then now thinking you'll be going back during Christmas break? Has this changed the way that you think about home in any way?
Well, with the honors program specifically, I'm starting to be trained to question everything. Right. I read and really challenge it and wrestle with it. And so I know that when I go back home, I'm going to be thinking differently too. And especially with the books we've been reading. And I love sharing what I've learned with my parents, but knowing that there's a section of things that I've learned that I can't share everything with them and that I've changed in that way. It's difficult, but also there's a level of independence as well, and realizing that I'm beginning to create a home elsewhere out of my family. I don't know if that makes sense. But
yeah, it makes total sense. Yeah, thank you. And I think for Christians as well, at least when I read this text, there's a better home, another country. There's all this language, especially with Abraham in the Bible. He's looking forward to a better country, and that Paul talks about us having a citizenship in heaven. And so when I read the Odyssey, there's just so many interesting parallels with the faith. Odysseus as this beggar king who comes to his people, who defeats his enemies. And so I see a lot of Christological parallels with Odysseus. But then with this concept of home, that ultimately, yes, we wrestle with our understanding of what home is here, but we're exiles. And I feel like an exile, just given my upbringing. And so I look forward to a better country when we will meet with Christ. So yeah. But thank you for discussing this with me. It was really helpful to hear your thoughts.